welcome to Calgary.
Thank you.
You're just telling me you're in the throes of the new book tour. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. Yeah,
I'm excited to unpack it a little bit with you. I was just saying to our audience in the introduction that it's a really relevant topic of conversation for the theme that we've had here over the last 2 days, which is this whole piece around how do we do a better job of driving collaboration. And part of what you've explored in this new book is how, typically the things that do really well when we associate with people that we know really well actually undermine us with people that we don't know so well, and we're trying to talk to strangers. Can you tell us a little bit about where the inspiration for the new book came from?
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that many of the kind of signature controversies of our time are at core about the same thing, which is they are about miscommunication and misunderstanding between strangers. So my book has each chapter is devoted to a different case. The Bernie Madoff is an example of misunderstanding a stranger. You give your money to someone who you don't know that well, and you think he's going to invest it honestly, and in fact, he's not.
Yep.
Or at the other end of the spectrum, remember the case of Amanda Knox, the young woman who goes to Italy on her year abroad, and her roommate gets murdered, and she gets put in jail, falsely accused of the crime, and put in jail for 4 years. The Italian police and the English tabloid media saw this stranger and completely misunderstood who she was and what she was, without a doubt, 100% innocent, and yet people convinced themselves she was a murderess, right? Or, I could go on. I tell stories about spies. Why is it so difficult to know when someone is, to uncover a spy? Because the thing about spies is it always takes like a decade for them to be caught. They're never caught. You don't start on day one spying and then someone's like, oh, wait a minute. No,
Bond movies.
You do it for years and years and years and years, and then someone stumbles across you. And this is really interesting because spy agencies are set up full of suspicious people whose job it is to find
spies.
Yes, those double agents, and they do a really bad job of it, which is also super, super interesting, right? So I had all of these, and then I go into a bunch of other cases in the book, but it just struck me that in a world where, we evolved as human beings in very, very close-knit family and intimate circles, clan circles, and now we're in a position where we have to deal overwhelmingly with people outside of our intimate circles. And the same skills, the skills that we were perfecting for, a couple 100,000 years that worked on the intimate group really don't work that well on strangers.
And what is it that we bring? What are the biases and assumptions that we bring to those new interactions that are almost undoing us in that way?
Yeah, well, there's a couple that I talk about in the book. Well, one would be, for example, that this is an idea that comes from a psychologist called Tim Levine. Psychologists have for years observed that as human beings, we do a terrible job of detecting deception. So if I were to show you 100 videotapes of 100 different people making a statement, half are lying, half are telling the truth, and I say to you, Holly, spot the liars for me, your accuracy rate would be almost certainly between 52 and 54%. You would be slightly better than chance. And almost without exception, everyone in this room would come in that range.
Even the people trained to be good at it.
Even and especially those trained.
Interesting.
Right? So there are one in every, for reasons we don't entirely understand, there are these 1 in a million people who do a good job at this, but everyone else is terrible, right? Overwhelmingly terrible. And the reason is, which doesn't seem to make any sense because you'd think evolution would have selected us for this.
Yeah.
But it didn't. Evolution selected us to trust people implicitly unless we're given overwhelming evidence to the contrary, right? And what that means is that that when people are trustworthy, communication is really efficient. It's why, anyone in here who has started a business knows exactly what I'm talking about. I just actually started a business in January, so now I can speak about this firsthand. When you start a business as an entrepreneur, you are required to throw an enormous amount of trust in the direction of the people who you recruit to work with you, right? You don't have time to vet them a million different ways, to get to know them, you're in a mad rush. You find someone who you think can help you, and you say, come work with me, and you pray it'll work out, right? That's what you do. But think about how would starting a business be possible if you were someone who was deeply suspicious and paranoid? The answer is you couldn't do it.
No.
Right? You would spend all of your time second-guessing everything. So we have this is an enormously adaptive tendency to trust everyone. It means we can communicate efficiently, we can form groups, we can collaborate, we can put our kids on the school bus in the morning and not, obsess about is the bus driver who he says he is, right? But it also means that we will be taken in occasionally by people who've set out to deceive us. And this psychologist, Tim Levine's point is that trade-off is worth it. In other words, occasional deception is a small price to pay for all of the extraordinary benefits that come from being someone who implicitly trusts others. And that is a really, really, really interesting notion if you unpack it.
It is. And it's also interesting to be talking about trust at a time where most of the conversation we're having about that word is about that the world's never been in such a state of trust in crisis.
Yeah.
And every time we read the annual reports and the trust barometer, we're talking about how it's dropping in our trust in institutions, in business leaders, you name it. How do you kind of reflect on that duality of those two things coexisting?
I have never understood this argument. To my mind, when I look around the world, I see more evidence of trust, not less. So think about this. I have on my phone an Uber app, and I will order a car, and from an app on my phone, without talking to a single human being, a car will show up, driven by someone I've never met, right? And I get into it, and I don't say a word or take out my wallet, and the car takes me someplace while I'm sitting, reading my email, and then I disembark. If you had said to me 20 years ago that I would engage in this behavior, I would have said you are insane, right? I lived in New York in the 90s. The idea you would get in a car driven by a stranger and then look away as the stranger whisked you through streets according to some unknown route supplied by an algorithm that no one is aware of, the whole thing is bananas. Or 20 years ago, so someone comes to you and say, you're going to leave town. While you're gone, you're going to let strangers into your house who you've never met, right? Who only know about you because they found you on an app, right? And then you're going to trust that they'll be nice to your house. They won't go through your stuff, and they'll pay you when you're done, when they're done, right? Again, in 1990, this is the most absurd idea. Can you imagine me pitching this idea?
Yeah.
In 1990, it would never have happened.
Down like a lead balloon,
Today, we're so fine with this idea that, I'll turn over my house to a stranger. So this is why I am deeply skeptical. There are these individual incidents that have strained our trust, for example, in political institutions. Fine. I kind of feel like with a simple change in, leadership.
Yeah. I thought we might be going there, maybe.
The trust will come back, right? But on a macro level, we are so much more insanely trusting today in the digital age than we were in the past that I don't even think it's close. I mean, it's and that is, that's the trajectory that we're on as a society, is that we're doing this more and more and more and more and more.
And you comment earlier about conflict being at the heart of so many of the challenges we're finding ourselves in right now. What advice have you got for those? I mean, I guess the theme we've been talking about over the conference is how do we start to break out of echo chambers and silos we've been operating in and start having conversations across the aisle and with perhaps non-traditional other parties? What advice have you got for approaching collaboration in a way that can lead to a constructive outcome?
Yeah. So I have spent a lot of time in my book talking about how various psychological assumptions that we hold can get us into trouble with strangers. And one of them is what psychologists call the transparency assumption. And the transparency assumption is the idea that the emotions someone feels on the inside are represented accurately and predictably on their face or in their body language or demeanor. So, and we carry this assumption around because that's the way TV works. So I actually did in my book this really fun thing where I took a 2-minute clip of a Friends episode and I gave it to a psychologist who was trained in something called FACS, which is this method of scoring all the facial, it's I've forgotten how many, 100 different facial expressions, and each has a number. And there are people who are trained in notating. So I gave her this, and it's every time anyone on Friends has a facial expression, tell me what it is. And then after she did that, we went through the episode, And we saw, so does their facial expression always match what they're feeling in that scene? So when Joey is angry, does his lips go tight? Does his brow furrow? Do his eyes narrow?
Does he look like an emoji, effectively?
Yes, exactly. Yes. When Ross is perplexed, as he always is, does his face look like the face of someone who's perplexed? Perfectly. When Phoebe is surprised, do Phoebe's eyebrows go up and her eyes go wide and her jaw drops? Yes. At one-to-one correlation between the way they feel and the way they look, to the point where even though Friends episodes have like the most insanely convoluted plots known to man, you can turn off the sound and you can still understand what happens. I've tried this. You should try it sometime. In fact, it's just as enjoyable. You don't have to listen. You can just turn it off and you're like, no, because, oh, Phoebe's mad right now. Of course she's mad. She looks mad, right?
Yep.
And if you watch enough Friends and things like it, you think that's the way the world works. That is not the way the world works. People don't do that, right? In real life, all of us represent our emotions in profoundly different ways. And when there is a cultural difference, sometimes those differences are even more marked. So there's a huge, fascinating literature on how do people behave when they are confronted with authority. And there are massive differences from one culture to the next. In some cultures, it is considered to be appropriate behavior when you're confronted with authority to avert your eyes and to make yourself small. In other cultures, you are required to look the cop in the eye and like speak clearly and plainly, and and if you don't do that, you're considered to be disrespectful or deceitful. Anyway, the point is there's an infinite amount of variety. All this is to say that when we are forming collaborations with people who are outside of our own circle, we need to be a lot more patient in the conclusions in how quickly we reach conclusions. In other words, you cannot know them as quickly as you want to know them, and you cannot expect to draw conclusions about them the way you could draw conclusions about someone who you know really well. And I would even go further. I'm on this personal campaign against job interviews.
Okay. What's the crusade?
The crusade is I don't believe in them. Because I really think that this is a classic example of this. So let's suppose I wanted to hire you. I have a little company. Suppose I wanted to hire you.
Sure.
Right. Now, what is gained by me meeting you, as opposed to talking to you on the phone or emailing with you? So let's suppose we just had an email conversation. I know about your work history. I know I can ask you all kinds of questions about the kinds of things what motivates you, what you're like. Blah, blah, blah. I can get a sense of who you are. I can call your former employees or employers or references and such. I can find out quite a lot about you. Just if I meet you, what happens though? To that base of very, very relevant and useful information, I'm adding a whole lot of information which isn't necessarily useful. Why is it relevant that you're tall? That your hair is dark and not blonde? That you're wearing a dress as opposed to pants? That your accent is the way, you have an Australian accent?
Correct, yeah.
Right. Is that useful information? Does that in any way? No, but what if I had a bias against Australians? Then I might...
That'd be a real shame, by the way.
Then I might let that fact get in the way of my appreciation of who you are. It is dangerous, unless, by the way, I'm hiring you to do something which directly involves the way that you present yourself. So if you're selling perfume in the ground floor of Saks Fifth Avenue, okay, I got to meet you. But like, for most things in life, am I sure I need to meet you? So I've been doing this now. When I hire people, I'm very, very, very cautious about the circumstances under which I meet them for the first time, because I don't want to expose myself to information that isn't relevant, precisely because I'm so aware of the ways in which we throw up these kind of impediments to getting to know people because we obsess about irrelevant information. And we need to be much more disciplined about that kind of extraneous information, particularly if we want to form groups across cultural boundaries. Right?
And I want to pick up on that cultural point and take you to a conversation that's been quite a consistent thread through Energy Disruptors, which is this piece around a lot of the time we've got the technology and the innovation. We really struggle with the human and cultural adaptation.
Yeah.
I'd be really interested, because I know this is something you've studied and
Oh,
you think about a lot.
Yeah.
What's your reflection on that? And are there lessons we can learn from history for how to be more effective at getting people on the journey?
So here's a great example. The telephone is invented in the 1860s, right? Here in Canada, by the way. The first telephone exchange is 1878. By 1900, you can make a transcontinental phone call.
Okay.
The tech is there, right? And it works. You can hear the person on the other end of the line. Blah, blah. But so this is clearly, in the history of innovations, one of the biggest ones ever. Right? It's up there with electricity and the light bulb and all kinds of things. It takes an incredible long time for the telephone to take off. In fact, it doesn't really get into homes across North America until the late 1920s. So it's invented in the 1860s. It's up and running by the end of the 1870s. It's in homes in North America in the late 1920s. That's crazy. Literally, somebody invented the best thing ever. And for 40 years, we were just twiddling our thumbs saying, I don't know, do I want the opportunity to talk to someone who I'm not next to? I don't know. I can't decide. Why? So it's a really interesting question. Why does the telephone take so long? And the answer it has nothing to do with the technology itself. It had to do with the social context in which it was understood and introduced. The people who ran the telephone industry in the early years were people who were men, it's a crucial fact, men who came from the telegraph industry.
Okay.
And the telegraph was a business instrument really only. You didn't chit-chat over telegrams, right? So they got the telephone and they were like, oh, it's a better version of the telegraph. So they sold it for the first 30 years as a business instrument. It was for B2B communication, or to the extent it was for consumers, it was for calling stores to find out whether they had something in stock. That was their sense of what this was before. They were actively opposed to what they called trivial uses of the instrument, which was chatting. And they were actively opposed to women using it because they thought this is a business instrument, it had no business in the hands of women. And they were actively opposed to rural uses of it because they didn't understand, if you don't understand that it's a social instrument that you might use to alleviate isolation, then you're like, well, why would I put it in the middle of nowhere?
So actively opposed to sort of all the valuable applications of it.
Exactly. They completely for a generation, they completely misunderstand the social function of this instrument, in large part because they are men who have the typical misogyny of their era, who associate everything social with women, right? With triviality, with something that's irrelevant to the kind of principal meaning of a new technology. And as a result, we take 30 years to embrace this instrument. So that's all about the ideas we have in our heads and the kind of social context of the innovation having an extraordinary impact on its adoption. And I think that pattern, you will see, you pick a new innovation and you will see a version of that. I mean, we never escape from this fact. It is rarely, the underlying tech is, which we always think is the hard part, or the long part, or the difficult part, invariably isn't. It's the thing we do quickly and, not easily, but we do it, we're really good at it, we do it quickly, we can solve those technical problems, and then we're left with the social problem, and we wrestle with it for a generation. I mean, I could give you 10 different examples of this same phenomenon.
And so there are lessons about how we can quicken that process, or is it just accepted that this is the slow learning journey? It's almost like we're not learning in many ways from history and kind of repeating that same process and cycle every time innovation comes along.
Well, in some cases, the problem is you don't know what you've got. So a great example is the VCR. VCR gets invented, or the technology of recording live television gets invented. And in the first round is the television industry, Hollywood, essentially saying, this is going to put us out of business. This is going to destroy, and they try and squash it. So they think of it entirely in terms of, oh, this means people will tape everything on TV, erase the commercials, and our business model is destroyed. That lasts for like 10 years or so. And then they're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not what's happening. In fact, what this is a way for us to sell people programs so they can have another copy that they can watch at their leisure. And they make $1 jillion doing that. And then there's round 3 where they're like, actually, that's not what this is about. Now we're in round 3. Round 3 is where you realize, oh, what recording technology allows people to do is to watch programming at their leisure, not at an appointed time. And that means we can tell stories differently. And so the whole golden age of television, which is continuous narratives, Sopranos, The Wire, Succession right now. I mean, I could tell all of these shows are shows that you have to watch them in order. You can only, as a storyteller, know that people are watching your show in order if they have a means of watching it on their own time. So everything we associate with how amazing television is comes from the invention of some sort of recording technology, right? It took Hollywood 25 years to figure that out, to figure out that, oh, this thing that initially we thought was going to put us out of business, and then secondarily we thought was just a marketing opportunity, is in fact something that fundamentally changes the nature of the stories that we tell, and the medium. Yeah. So that's super interesting, and I don't know whether, in that case, there's a way to speed it up, because you're just living with a technology that's complicated, and you have to kind of see in real time how people, like what the early people in Hollywood didn't understand is how storytellers would react to this technology. So finally, the storytellers stood up at places like HBO and said, no, why can't I tell a continuous narrative over an entire season? And they're like, oh my goodness, right? That's never happened before in TV. But in other cases, I think, like in the telephone, the telephone is delayed for a generation because all the people running the telephone business are men who came from the telegraph industry. Like, that's the case. In a telephone, you can speed it up if you have a diverse set of viewpoints.
I was just thinking that, how do we avoid sort of misunderstanding innovation? In part, it seems, who do we give the opportunity to play with that innovation when it's first invented?
You must have, this is the reason for having diversity in leadership circles, right? Because you need to have someone in the back of the room raise their hand and say, actually, I want to gossip on the telephone, right? And that actually is what all my friends want to do. And this is an insane business. Like, allowing people to gossip on the telephone. And so that is a kind of, in those cases, I think the powerful lesson is let different voices from different backgrounds into your decision-making structure.
And it's interesting, I kind of want to pick up on that diversity point, because I know a lot of what you've looked at is over time how you build social momentum behind ideas and why things do or don't succeed. You look at something like that, and I feel like it's been accepted wisdom for some time that diversity has inherent benefits, and yet we're still on a almost glacial pace to actually seeing that broadly uptaken within society. Why do you feel there's this disconnect often between what we believe to be true or the right way of working and then the reality of how we behaviourally operate?
Yeah. Well, because there's a tension between efficiency and, between efficiency and ultimate productivity. So when I let in someone who is different from me, it requires more from me, right? More effort. I need to understand them differently. I can't use the same shorthands. I need to adjust the culture. I need to do all kinds of things that are costly in one sense, and that give me either the real or imagined sense of being slowed down. Right? On the other side of the equation is the benefit of that isn't necessarily obvious in the beginning, but could be, the upside is huge. That, if the telephone industry figures out the telephone even 10 years earlier, they left untold amounts of money on the table, right? Not to mention all the kind of social good that could have come from. So that's the kind of, and I think we too easily default into the short-term efficiency of homogeneous organizations, and don't stop and think about how there would be these kind of large, unanticipated benefits to heterogeneity.
I wanted to touch on storytelling with you. You're renowned as one of the most masterful storytellers. It's an interesting time for communication. It's something that leaders are grappling with left, right and centre. You've got increasing fake news, polarisation, tribalism almost. In this day and age, what does it take to tell a good story? What does it take to put a message out there that can get engagement and can start a different kind of conversation? It seems like a very challenging environment to get cut through in this day and age. Do you have advice for leaders in the room for how to position their message and connect with people?
Is it challenging? Maybe I'm just an optimist. I kind of feel like it's the best possible time for, if you are an authentic, if you have an authentic story to tell, there has never been a better time, I think, than now, right? I mean, I just look, you wander through the aisles of a grocery store or any kind of retail establishment, just to pick one example, and the number of new products you see there, that weren't there 5 years ago, and they're there because they have a very specific and real function. Like, I'll give you an example. This morning in the San Francisco airport, I bought one of those paper, what are they called? Bottles, those paper things for water, full of coconut water.
Okay.
100%, organic, whatever, coconut water. You could not get coconut water in an airport like 5 years ago, right?
Yeah.
You get soft drink, you get Coca-Cola, and you get like all kinds of nasty stuff, but you couldn't get that. That company, whoever it is, I don't even know what the brand was, I just saw this thing, went from 0 to 60 in the space of a very small number of years. Why? Because you could do that today.
Yeah.
You can find an audience, you can communicate with them directly, you can, I did something on my Revisionist History podcast. We have sponsors, and AT&T sponsored a couple of ads, and now I realize AT&T, not exactly an upstart, but nonetheless, bear with me. They wanted to talk about 5G, nothing to do with AT&T. They just wanted to explain to the listeners of my podcast what 5G was, how it would change our world, and why they should be excited about it. So we taped these little segments. They're like ads, but they were like little conversations between me and a person at AT&T. There was no selling of AT&T. There was just a fun conversation about like what happens 5 years from now with 5G, right? And we got the metrics, because it's a podcast, you can get the metrics. What percentage of listeners fast-forwarded through that? What percentage of listeners actually listened? And the answer is we had, I think, 91% listened through on these 5G spots. Now, I look at that and I say, here's somebody who wanted to reach a large audience to have a sophisticated conversation about a new technology. And they paid a small sum of money, an embarrassingly small sum of money, to Malcolm Gladwell to get this message out.
You have to work on that in your new business, by the way.
And I look at that and like, 10 years ago, you could not do that. Yeah. 3 million people download an episode of my podcast. They reached 3 million, 91% of 3 million.
Who listens in the room? Who's a listener to Revisionist History? Yeah, lots. Yes. There we go.
So we have some listeners. That's fantastic, right? Now, it only works. It would not have worked if they did a straight AT&T ad.
Yeah.
The listen through would have been 5%, right? But because they wanted to do something thoughtful and credible, they got a large market. And that's the lesson. If you want to do crap in today's marketplace, you will get nowhere. But if you want to do something real and authentic, I think that you have a better opportunity than ever before.
I want to ask you about your own creative process, because one of the things you do consistently with, and it's a reason that you're multiple times New York best-selling author, is challenge the way that we have traditionally looked at something. You come from outside the box in a totally different perspective, and in many ways it debunks accepted wisdom. What do you do, or how do you get yourself outside getting caught in the day-to-day and the status quo, or the same perception that we've had for some period of time, to give yourself the ability to challenge thinking and push us in new dimensions?
Yeah. Well, what you discover if you do the kind of journalism I do is that most of the time when people are weighing in on a subject, they haven't done their homework. So all you really have to do is do your homework, right? It's not that hard. I mean, it's not that hard. And most of the positions, like in this book, Talking to Strangers, that's just come out, it's a couple of chapters about very controversial court cases. And the first thing I did was order the court transcripts, like all the transcripts from all of the associated legal actions around these cases. And I read them from start to finish.
Wow.
They could be 1,000 pages. So you read them, and what you discover is, after you've read them, and then you read the kind of corresponding journalism, you begin to seriously question whether anyone has ever read them. Like, I really think I was the first guy to read the whole transcript. Like, 'cause
mildly alarming.
you read the way these cases are discussed, you're like, well, you didn't see that thing on page 768? Like, where that whole thing was addressed and, and settled, and like, so it's not hard. It's, in a world where there is so much going on and where there is so much stuff to get through, if you are willing to do your homework, you will almost automatically be in a position to tell a story that the rest of the media is not telling.
Yeah.
And so it's as simple as that, I think.
And what perspectives do you choose to bring into the mix as well? Because I imagine it's not just getting the transcript as it was, it's also intentionally thinking about who are the inputs and sources and how do I widely curate what it is that I'm absorbing. Yeah. How do you go about that quite intentionally?
Well, I don't. I just my basic position is that I am I am an optimist, and I'm also someone who tends to give people the benefit of the doubt. Mm-hmm. So that if you are in these kinds of cases where there is someone who I think is important to the story, I just make sure I go and see them and let them give their side of the story and listen. And listen.
Yeah.
It's one thing to talk to them; it's another thing to listen to them. And you can disagree at the end, but just so long as you have let this person represent their case for however many hours, and then make up your mind. That's what makes the difference.
I was thrilled, talking to you last week, just about your enthusiasm at being here and being a part of the Energy Disruptors conversation. I'm interested just for you to share with the audience here, what is it that attracted you to be a part of a conversation around energy, and what of the work that you've been doing of late do you think is most relevant for our audience who are in some way, shape or form engaged in this conversation and challenge to take away and think about?
Yeah. Well, it's such a fascinating, I'm not telling anyone in this audience anything you don't already know, but anytime you have a problem that touches on virtually every part of every sort of major institution in society, and so you have, this is a problem that engages the people who are dealing with the technology, that engages government, that engages consumers, that engages regulators, that engages, those kind of multidimensional problems are insanely interesting. Like I didn't catch his first name. I was talking backstage to the guy who spoke earlier from Microsoft.
Brian?
Yes, that's him. Like, I just asked him questions for like 45 minutes. Like, super interesting. He has to think about every one of those quadrants. He has to know, and then add to the fact, he told me that, $120 billion was spent last year on servers. Like, add to that many zeros, and you have like a kind of, I was joking with him that if you ranked everyone in the world by the size of the checks they write every year, he's like got to be top 5. Who's writing a bigger check than that guy? Like, he must write multi-billion-dollar checks. Like, has anyone written a multi-billion-dollar check? I don't think so, right?
I have not.
It's like some Saudi guy, him, and then I don't know who else, like somebody, Jeff Bezos' divorce settlement, that'll be up there. But there's just those 3.
This is true. It's probably about right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the scale and the nature of the challenge.
It's just incredibly fascinating. So it's just like kind of any of those kinds of problems are catnip for me.
And what lessons from problems that you've studied in the past? One of the things I love that you do, particularly with the Revisionist History podcast, is you take us to moments in time that deserve a re-observation, a reconsideration perhaps, a second chance, I think is the way that you put it in the introduction.
Yeah.
What, if anything, can we learn from some of the great multi-dimensional problems of history that we can apply to thinking about tackling the challenges of today?
Yeah. That's a really, really good and hard question, and everyone in this audience will knows more about this than I do. But I guess I would say that when you realize that the problem is multidimensional, then you realize that the solutions have to be multidimensional. You have to have people who are capable who are comfortable in all of those different quadrants. And the one area where I am a little bit of a pessimist these days is I see fewer and fewer either people or institutions who can play effectively in all those quadrants. Like everything's being kind of divided up, and I don't see, like I would like to think that, the people who are pushing for, EVs were kind of intimate in the sense that we're able to have meaningful conversations with regulators, let's say, I'm just giving an example of, you would hope that there was some kind of meaningful, ongoing conversation between those groups where they all had some kind of common goal in mind. And I get sometimes a little bit disheartened that there aren't as many of those sorts of conversations as I would like.
Yeah. And do you think, what advice have you got for how we can foster those? Because a lot of what your books have studied is the biases we come into interactions with, the misconceptions, the barrier that language or a single dimension story often creates to the way that we interact. Are there any frameworks or tips for things the audience can be thinking about to actually make that a reality?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest challenges for people in the business and technology community is to successfully communicate their enthusiasm to the rest of the world. Because it's within those circles, there's an awful lot of enthusiasm, but I wonder whether, if you're an ordinary citizen who's living your life and driving your normal car and getting your electricity off the grid, it's very difficult for you to know what stage all of this change and progress and excitement is at, right? You don't have access to any of that. And if you don't have access to any of that, you have no idea whether you should be optimistic or pessimistic. You have no idea how you should vote in an election or how you should respond to one initiative or another. So I think if people got a sense that this is not Star Trek stuff, this is like now and, at the very most, it's about tomorrow. It's really about today. If the general public understood that, you might have a very different context for these discussions. I'm a little bit, and I will say parenthetically that the second challenge, which is part of that, is that right now the companies like, the high-profile companies in Silicon Valley, like the media companies, the Facebooks, the Twitters, some such, they dominate way too much of the conversation, right? At the end of the day, Twitter is completely irrelevant, and Facebook is not nearly as relevant as, Facebook is turning into basically just a photo album, right? If Facebook and Instagram disappeared tomorrow, what would happen? Nothing would happen. The world would be exactly the same, right? There would be, so the idea that in the public mind, the poster children for 21st century digital technology is a company whose ultimate social function is irrelevant. That's problematic.
Yeah.
I would much rather the poster children for 21st century technology be someone who is doing something that is absolutely integral to our future happiness and progress, right? And that I would love the kind of the power structure of that debate to shift a little bit.
It's a great call to action to do a better job of sharing the enthusiasm of what it is we're working on and creating. I wanted to pick up, you mentioned optimism and pessimism there. I know you declared yourself an optimist. What gives you the greatest sense of optimism about how the next generation is going to play out? And what is it that you believe is a challenge that we've really got to put our collective brainpower to in order to make sure that that optimistic future can come to life?
Yeah. Well, of course, speaking about optimism at this particular moment in history, it's difficult. I am a macro-optimist, and it might not be a micro-optimist at the moment.
Nothing related to Twitter or anything to do with that?
I am. One thing so I said I started a company in January.
Yes.
And we have a bunch of employees who are under the age of 30. Roughly half the company is under 30. Now the company only has 12 people. So when I say half the company, I mean 6. So our 6 millennials and what's the younger version? I forgot what they call it. It's too complicated.
Gen Z?
Yeah, that's it. We got 6 of them. And they fill me with an enormous amount of hope. They really, I'm not one of those people who thinks that every 9-year increment represents a sea change. And some people have names for generations that I can't even track anymore. It's so salami slicing. But I do think something significant has happened over in the sort of the people born into the digital age. And their attitudes towards things like collaboration and diversity and the openness of their minds and their enthusiasm for technology as a way to make things better. All of those things really, really, really fill me with optimism. I really think when that generation, I have a very dim view of my own generation, which I think as generations go is like a pretty lousy one, and I'll be glad when we're out of the picture. But I have a lot of optimism for this younger cohort, because I think their head is on right, and they're better adapted to the world as it's changing.
Do I take that comment to imply you would be a supporter of more intergenerational collaboration and leadership and a shift in kind of the dynamic of the power structure, so to speak?
So it's funny, yesterday I did this thing with YouTube to promote my book, and they have these YouTube book channels, BookTube. First of all, if you look at the traffic on those things, it's like, 10x traditional media. It's like insane. And the people, they had 4 of the most prominent booktubers interviewing on stage with me, and we were doing this thing and they were filming it. One of them was like 35, one was 20, one was 19, and one was 24, right? So the idea that this hugely influential thing is being driven, 3 out of the 4 were basically, 2 were still in school, and one was like just graduated, right? And these guys are at the center of it. And you realize that, this whole thing is changing in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
And they're not waiting until they're 40 to take into positions of leadership. So it's really it is generationally, I'm actually of the belief that generational perspectives on the particular problems we have now are the most useful ones. If you had to pick one paradigm, like to explain American politics, for example, it's not an ideological thing that's going on right now. It's a generational thing. It's about young people versus old people, right? It is not about right-wingers versus left-wingers. And the kind of fears that have gripped North America, particularly America at the moment, are very much the fear of, they're old people fears, right? They're not conservative fears. We have the kind of politics that you have when you have a graying society. And if that frames the kind of challenge of changing and adapting, I think makes it it's different. You have to be able to kind of cross that generational divide and speak to what are very real fears and anxieties that older generations have and have always had, right? And also it changes your attitude towards them. It means if you think this is all ideological, then it's all about a fight. If you understand that it's generational, then you realize, oh no, this is about changing the way we talk and empathize and communicate across generational barriers. That's a very, very, very different sort of problem.
It's enormous. That's a huge challenge for all of us. I wanted to ask my final question, because unfortunately our time's drawing to a close, and we've got a panel conversation to continue this dialogue with. But I'm intrigued, as someone who's really a student of humanity and strikes me as absolutely forensically curious, of all the things you have uncovered or debunked about humanity over the years, what has most profoundly impacted the way that you think and work?
Oh, wow. Well, I had many hobby horses, to put it mildly. And I have, one of them has been my ongoing war against American elite education, which I think is morally disgraceful. And I've been haranguing on this with increasing hysteria for quite some time, to the point where everyone in my life is thoroughly sick of it, but I haven't stopped. And it's made me think about 2 things. One is it's really profoundly changed my notion of what philanthropy ought to look like. And I continue to marvel at how difficult it is to communicate to people the notion that your philanthropic dollars should go towards people who need them as opposed to people who don't need them, right? Whereas in America, philanthropic dollars, particularly in education, go almost entirely to institutions that are already wealthy, which I find so bizarre. But it's also made me think long and hard about the extent to which education, the stratification of education has become the enemy of social mobility and fairness in society as opposed to the friend of it. And so how has it changed me? I now, for example, when I hire people, I make them redact the name of the institutions, educational institutions they attended. That's my own personal battle against educational stratification. I don't care. It's not relevant. Why does it matter? Like, how does it help me to know that it just distracts me from paying attention to the person, to the actual ability of the person? And I feel like if everyone in the world adopted this practice of saying you can go wherever you want to school, but once you're done, it's over. You can't talk about it, and no one can ask you about it. It's a buried part of your past, right?
Seems to dovetail into the job interview conversation as well earlier.
It's like, it's incredibly liberating.
Yep.
So go where you want to go. Don't go where because you have some weird like fantasy about how this will help you later on in life. No. Go where you want to go. And then it's buried in a box and no one can ever look at it again. And you go out in the world with a clean slate. I think that's a beautiful notion.
I like that hobby horse, and I have enjoyed every second of getting the opportunity to pick your brain. Ladies and gentlemen, can you thank Malcolm Gladwell with me? Thank you so much.